It is the autumn of 1942, and Britain is hungry. Not starving, not yet, but the kind of gnawing, constant hunger that settles into your bones after 3 years of war rationing. Every man, woman, and child carries with them a small, unassuming booklet, their ration book. It is, in many ways, the most important document in the country, more vital in daily life than a passport, more consulted than a bank statement. Without it, you cannot buy butter, cannot purchase a rasher of bacon, cannot acquire the modest allowance of sugar that makes an otherwise bleak week feel slightly more bearable. The ration book has become the very heartbeat of civilian life in wartime Britain. But there is something else the ration book has become, something its designers at the Ministry of Food almost certainly never intended. It has become a trap, a remarkably effective, beautifully mundane trap, one that would expose an enemy agent not through any feat of brilliant detective work, not through signals intelligence or a turned double agent, but through a single catastrophic misunderstanding of how ordinary British people live. This is the story of how a spy, trained, equipped, and dispatched by Nazi Germany's Abwehr intelligence service, gave himself away not with a careless transmission or a suspicious meeting, but by doing something that no genuine British resident would ever do. By the time the Abwehr began deploying agents to the British mainland in earnest, the German intelligence apparatus understood that Britain was a difficult target. The island nation had, by 1940, already rolled up virtually every German spy operating on its soil, a fact the British government kept carefully concealed, ensuring that Berlin believed its network was still active and reporting reliably. In reality, MI5's famous double-cross system had transformed these captured agents into puppets, feeding carefully constructed disinformation back to their German handlers. The problem for Germany was not a lack of willing agents. The Abwehr had no shortage of recruits, some motivated by ideology, others by money, a handful by coercion or desperation. The problem was preparation. Training a spy to pass as an ordinary British citizen required a depth of cultural knowledge that was extraordinarily difficult to acquire from the outside. The texture of daily British life, the habits, the customs, the small rhythms of how people moved through their days, was not something that could be learned from briefing documents or even from pre-war visits to the country. The ration book sat at the center of this texture. Introduced in January 1940, the system had grown into an elaborate bureaucratic machine. By 1942, the books covered not merely food, but clothing, petrol, and a host of other essentials. Every household was registered with specific local shops, your butcher, your grocer, and transactions were recorded with meticulous care. The books themselves were issued by local food offices, cross-referenced against census data and identity cards, and renewed periodically. They were, in short, deeply embedded in the infrastructure of British life. An agent dropped into Britain needed a ration book. This was not negotiable. Without one, even the simplest daily transaction, buying a meal at a cafe, purchasing a loaf of bread, would immediately mark a person as anomalous. The Abwehr understood this and provided their agents with forged documents, including ration books of varying quality. What they failed entirely to understand was how British people actually used them. The agent arrived in Britain in late 1942. His name, at least the name he was operating under, is less important than what he did in the first days after his arrival. He had been well briefed on the mechanics of British rationing, the coupon system, the registration requirements, the general outline of how the books functioned. He had a forged book, reasonably well produced, with the appropriate registration stamps and the correct style of official printing. He was, by the standards of Abwehr preparation, relatively well equipped, and he proceeded to make an error so fundamental, so perfectly illustrative of the gap between theoretical briefing and lived experience, that it essentially announced his presence to the British authorities within days. He went to a shop and used coupons from the wrong week. That description, stated baldly, may not sound remarkable, but consider what it reveals. Every British person who had lived through the rationing system, every housewife, every lodging housekeeper, every shopkeeper, understood instinctively that the ration book operated on a precise weekly cycle. Coupons were valid only in their designated period. You did not skip ahead, you did not fall behind, you did not present a coupon from a future allocation or a past one. The rhythm was as natural and automatic as breathing. You used this week's coupons this week. That was simply how it worked. The agent, briefed on the existence of the coupon system, but not immersed in its daily reality, had not internalized this rhythm. He presented coupons that were either ahead of or behind the current valid period, the precise details of which direction vary slightly depending on the source, as the full intelligence file remained classified for decades. But the effect was identical regardless. The shopkeeper recognized immediately that something was wrong. Not that a spy stood before them, necessarily, but that this person did not understand how ration books actually worked. And in 1942, Britain, that was an extraordinary thing, because every British person did understand it. It was as automatic as knowing which side of the road to drive on. If you are finding this story as fascinating as we do, a quick subscribe helps this channel reach more people who love forgotten history. It truly makes all the difference. The report that reached the relevant authorities was not, in its initial form, a report about a spy. It was a report about an anomalous ration book transaction, the kind of administrative irregularity that the Ministry of Food's machinery was actually quite good at flagging. The wartime bureaucracy, for all its frustrations, had created a system in which shopkeepers and local officials were acutely attuned to anything that did not fit the expected pattern. Irregularities were supposed to be reported, and they were. MI5's involvement came through the established channels that had been carefully constructed over the preceding 2 years. The double-cross operation had taught British intelligence a great deal about how to respond to potential enemy agents. The goal, wherever possible, was not simply to arrest, but to assess, to determine whether the individual could be turned or used, and to extract maximum intelligence about Abwehr methods and networks before making any move. In this case, the assessment was relatively swift. The agent, placed under discreet surveillance, displayed enough additional anomalies. In his movement patterns, his apparent unfamiliarity with the physical layout of the area he claimed to know, and certain peculiarities in his cover story, that MI5 was confident within a short period that they were dealing with an Abwehr asset. The ration book error had not been the sole evidence, but it had been the thread that unraveled the initial camouflage. What the German intelligence services had fundamentally misunderstood was that daily life under rationing was not merely a system to be learned. It was a culture to be absorbed. The ration book was not simply a document. It was a social practice, embedded in conversations between neighbors, in the habits of housewives comparing their allocations, in the gentle community of shared privation that had become one of the unexpected social bonds of wartime Britain. A person who had genuinely lived through 3 years of rationing did not need to think about the coupon cycle any more than they needed to think about breathing. An agent briefed on it from the outside treated it as information to be memorized. And memorized information, under the pressure of operating in a hostile country, had a way of developing gaps. The Germans had, in fact, attempted to solve this problem. The Abwehr invested considerable resources in what might be called the cultural preparation of agents, extended briefings on British customs, the acquisition of genuine British documents where possible, even the deployment of agents who had spent extended periods in Britain before the war. Some of these preparations were genuinely sophisticated. Forged identity cards and ration books were produced using actual British printing techniques, with authentic-looking official stamps. Cover stories were constructed with careful attention to verifiable detail. But the Abwehr's fundamental weakness was institutional. The organization was large, bureaucratic, and compartmentalized in ways that prevented the kind of holistic intelligence picture that effective agent preparation required. Information about how British rationing actually worked at the street level. The kind of granular detail that could only come from someone who had stood in a queue at a grocer's and watched how transactions unfolded, was simply not available to the briefing officers in Hamburg or Paris or Madrid. By contrast, the American Office of Strategic Services, when it began preparing agents for European deployment, drew heavily on the experience of genuine immigrants and refugees, people who could speak to daily life not from documents, but from memory. The British Special Operations Executive employed a similar approach with remarkable effectiveness for agents entering occupied France, ensuring that women agents in particular were briefed on the specific regional customs around food queues and market days that could expose an outsider instantly. The Abwehr, operating in the reverse direction, preparing continental Europeans or others to pass as British, lacked this reservoir of intimate knowledge. The result was a pattern of errors that, individually, might have seemed minor, but collectively created a profile that trained observers could recognize. The impact of this episode, and of the dozens of similar cases that preceded and followed it across the war years, was both practical and profound. At the practical level, it reinforced MI5's conviction that the double-cross system was essentially complete, that there were no significant Abwehr networks operating independently in Britain. Every agent dispatched and not accounted for had either been captured, turned, or was dead. The ration book failure was one data point in a much larger picture of German intelligence defeat on British soil. The more profound impact was on the thinking of intelligence services about the nature of cover identities. The lesson was not simply that forged documents needed to be better, though they did. The lesson was that documentation was only the surface layer of a cover. Beneath it lay behavior, habit, instinct, and cultural reflex. These were not things that could be briefed into an agent over a few weeks. They had to be lived. MI5's analysis of the captured agents, and by this point in the war, the organization had processed a remarkable number of them, consistently identified the same categories of failure. Language was one. Not the formal English of a grammar textbook, but the regional inflections, the slang, the class markers that a genuine Briton deployed without thinking. Social behavior was another. How to queue without appearing to perform the act of queuing, how to interact with a landlady, how to navigate a pub without drawing attention. And daily administrative life, the rhythms of the ration book, the habits around identity cards, the small transactions of constrained wartime existence, was the third. Surviving records of MI5's wartime operations are held in the National Archives at Kew, where researchers have spent decades reconstructing the picture of what the official history eventually termed the most complete counterintelligence success of any nation in the Second World War. Return, for a moment, to that autumn of 1942. To the shopkeeper behind the counter. Possibly a woman, since by this point of the war a great many shopkeepers were. Looking at the coupons being presented and feeling something indefinably wrong. Not alarm, not the dramatic realization that an enemy spy stood before her. Just a quiet, certain knowledge that this was not right, that this was not how it was done. The kind of knowledge that comes not from training, but from 3 years of doing the same thing, week after week, in the same small shop on the same street, watching the same neighbors present the same books in the same proper sequence. She did what a responsible citizen in wartime Britain was supposed to do. She flagged the irregularity. She reported it through the channels that existed for precisely this purpose, and somewhere in the chain of events that followed. The quiet surveillance, the careful assessment, the eventual unraveling of a cover story that had seemed, on paper, quite convincing. An Abwehr agent who had been dispatched with high hopes and reasonable preparation discovered that his training had left out the one thing that mattered most. You cannot fake belonging. You cannot brief someone into the bone-deep familiarity of having lived a life. The Ration book did not catch a spy because it was clever. It caught a spy because it was ordinary. So thoroughly woven into the fabric of British daily existence that anyone who did not understand it instantly revealed themselves as someone who had not been there. The most sophisticated intelligence operation of the Second World War was not broken by a codebreaker or a turned agent or a brilliant analyst in a Whitehall office. In this case, at least, it was broken by a shopkeeper, a ration book, and the inescapable fact that ordinary life lived long enough leaves marks that cannot be counterfeited. The Abwehr had trained their agents in the language of Britain. What they had never managed to teach them was the accent of its days.